Hi there. We're so glad to see you today. I'm Lauren Borchard, Director of Historical Programs here at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. Today, we're back with Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane. They'll be talking today about L'Enfance, Washington, the great city square that never was. I'll turn it over now to Jane Campbell, the President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And welcome to Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane. Steve Livengood is our tour guide, our chief tour guide, our director of public programs. And we are so fortunate at the Capitol Historical Society to have Steve with us. Steve has been doing tours of the Capitol for nearly 50 years, and he has an extensive knowledge of all of the stories and tales of the Capitol, the history of the Capitol. He has done research. He has walked through its halls, walked on its grounds, and engaged with people who really understand that the Capitol is more than a building. The Capitol is our symbol of the American dream, the American democracy, and that experiencing our government is something that is done both in the Capitol, in the work of the people in the Capitol, and in the grounds all around them. And so today we are going to an intersection where we're going to look at what has happened where there was going to be a grand square, and what was the plan for that grand square, and why didn't it happen? Steve has incorporated both historical photos and current photos, and so this is the story of the grand square that never was. Steve, walk us through today from the eyes of history.
Okay, what you see on the screen here is part of the map of Washington, D.C. And you can see right through the middle is the Potomac River, and to the right is what was then known as the Eastern Branch. We call it the Anacostia River now. Right in the middle is a white spot with a point down at the bottom. And if you look at the point there, you can see he has even sketched in the cannons that were to be there. That was to be the battery to defend the city. But to the right of that, you can see this series of black lines, and that was a canal system. That was actually built for a while. And up where it bends and goes straight north and south at one point, you can see a large open space there, and that was to be the Great Washington City Square. That's what we're going to talk about. Here you get a sense of it, more about where you are. You can see the Capitol at the top and the mall to the left of that. This is another view, and it's slightly twisted. The north is off to the left a little bit here, but if you know the city, you can see the Capitol in this kind of the center, a little bit to the upper right of center, and then the White House, the lower left of center, and below the Capitol on the right and below the Capitol, you can see this large square. And I show you this because you can see that those 3 points are the 3 most important points in the plan. So many avenues come together at those 3 points. The question is, if it was to be so important, why don't we know it today? Here again, you can see another view that map doesn't resolve very well, so the photograph is fuzzy, but you get a sense of the Capitol at the top and South Capitol Street coming straight down, and this square. Now, what we're going to do is to walk down toward it, but I want to describe the square itself a little bit. Let me go back here. I want to describe the square itself and give you a sense of its importance. There is South Capitol Street that actually becomes the canal right at that point, and then goes through the square and then splits into two canals before it goes down to the Anacostia River. So that was one side of the square. And the avenue that crosses from upper left to lower right is Virginia Avenue. That still exists. The one that is paired with it and comes in from the right from that park at the top right is North Carolina Avenue, and that one ends at the square there. The one just below it is South Carolina Avenue. Both these avenues still exist. And South Carolina went through the square and out the other side, but then stopped at the next avenue. So you've got 4 state avenues. Oh, because I missed the one I missed is the one that comes from the Capitol to the right side of the square, and that is New Jersey Avenue. New Jersey Avenue continued through the square and down to the river, and the major and joins up again with the canal, and that was to be the major port in the city. And so that gives you an idea of the importance of the square itself. And what defined it, it also included not only South Capitol, but First Street, and at one point it goes over to Second Street. It included E Street, F Street, G, H, and I streets in both Southeast and Southwest. This was to be the market area. And what's kind of a blur to the left of the canal there was the market area. And on the right, you can see kind of, again, a blur that's separated out. And that was to be the great national church. L'Enfant himself was a Catholic, but of course the church, given the Protestant situation of the United States, that church was more likely to be Episcopalian or Anglican. But it wasn't particularly designated what it would be, but there was to be a major building there. And so you can see that between the market and the cathedral, this is a copy of the European city squares, and that was L'Enfant's intention when he designed it. There were to be storefronts along South Capitol Street, particularly below the square here. So this would be the shopping area as well, as one would find in a European city. Now we're going to walk down toward there. We're now on the Capitol grounds, and we're looking south down New Jersey Avenue. And this is the way we would have started. And this is what it looks like now. On the left, you see the Cannon House office building, and on the right, the Longworth office building. And then in the distance, you can see an apartment building that's brand new, 11 stories. And at the top, you can see there's kind of an arcade. And some of the photographs that I'm going to be showing you were taken from that arcade, so you get a sense of what is there now. So we're going to walk toward this, but we're going to skip to the next corner down at the end of these 2 buildings. And the reason is that that's where we have the historic photograph taken. This is the left side of the previous photograph. And these are the buildings that were torn down for the creation of the Cannon House office building. This block was, for the early part of its history, the most important block in the city of Washington. The bank was here, the first bank. That building in the center that's a little lighter colored was the Bank of Washington. The president of the bank was Daniel Carroll, who had owned this property. And that bank folded only just a few years ago. I had my account there. It was called the National Bank of Washington at that point. And so it existed until recently. And their main bank building downtown is just finally being restored this year. The first hardware store, the first bookstore, the first printer were all on this block. This was this was the major business block, certainly for the Capitol Hill area. But most important is the house on the right. That house was built in 1795, was built several years before the government even arrived here. And its purpose was to make a social statement on behalf of one person, Thomas Law. Thomas Law had made a fortune in India, and he was an Englishman, had made a fortune in India, and but the law said he could not marry an Indian woman. That didn't stop him from having several children, and so he had mixed race children, and he knew that they could not settle well in England, and so he brought his fortune to America and decided to invest it in the creation of this country. He bought land in New York and some in Canada and various other places, but he decided to put his roots down here in Washington, D.C., particularly after he figured out that Martha Washington had an eligible granddaughter. And so he courted Eliza Custis, Martha Washington's granddaughter, and he was 40 and she was 20, and this was to be their home. It was to be the one of the leading social houses in Washington, D.C. But after they married, it was not ready yet for them to move into. They knew it would just be a few months, and so they rented a house over on the waterfront that was much smaller, but at least was quite large by the standards of the other buildings around. That house over on the waterfront still exists, but this one has been torn down. But to understand the importance of it, you need to know that it was here on the most important block in Washington, and it looked down on that square. This is another building that was along that block there. This is a sketch of it, and its importance is that after the British burned the Capitol, the Supreme Court had to have a place to meet, and they bought this house, and the justices actually lived in it until they could move the Supreme Court back into the Capitol building. This
Steve,
is another.
We got a couple, you know, as you're talking, people are getting so excited, and they're still trying to exactly figure out where this square is. Is it on South Capitol? And what's the intersection street?
Okay, the square is between South Capitol and New Jersey, and the intersections are those avenues: Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and New Jersey, and it included First and Second Street Southeast, E, F, G, H, and I streets in both Southeast and Southwest.
Wow.
That'll become clearer as I show what it looks like now.
Oh, okay, great. And do you know, one other question, was it L'Enfant that came up with the idea of naming the avenues after the states?
It's a little uncertain. He wanted to name something for the states, but there's one theory that in fact he wanted to name the circles after the states and get the states to compete in building buildings on their circle.
Oh.
So the plans were shifting a lot, and if you noticed in those drawings that I showed, the drawings don't match up because the plans shifted very quickly. I just want to quickly mention this man. This was a drawing that was done in his honor when he died fairly young. His name is William Costin, and you would not suspect from this drawing. What's in the background is the Bank of Washington, and William Costin was the night porter. That is, he slept in the bank and served as the night depository. So if you got there after the bank closed, he would take your deposit. But you would never tell from this drawing that this is a formerly enslaved man. William Costin was one of Martha Washington's enslaved people who was freed after Martha's death and became a major figure in Washington history, actually owned some of the property on Capitol Hill and so forth. It's another story, but I wanted to just throw that in because he worked in the bank there on that block of New Jersey Avenue. This I want to show you is the map that was made after the British invaded and burned large parts of the city. It was done by Benjamin Latrobe, and it was done for the purpose of evaluating whether there was enough left here to try to continue here, or whether they should move the capital somewhere else. The black smear that you see through the map is not somebody's playing around with it. That is the topography, and that indicates a very steep slope. You can see it runs around the west side of the left side of the Capitol there, and down, and runs across South Capitol Street there, and then down behind New Jersey Avenue. And that became very important in how the buildings got developed, because it was difficult to develop along that slope. But this shows the buildings that were there in 1815 when Latrobe made the map. And I'm going to be showing different blocks here and talking about them that I have done as enlargements from this map. So this is what it looks like now from the lower end, and you can see the Longworth building on the right and the Cannon building on the left, and then behind the row of trees in the center, you can see the Capitol building back there. This is what it looks like today. We're on New Jersey Avenue, and we're going to walk down New Jersey. So now this is the Cannon building on the right, and on the left you can see Thomas Law's house there and that row of buildings that replaced it. So this is, on the left is what it looked like before the Cannon building was built, and most of those buildings would date to the very beginnings of Washington, D.C. And this is that block from the Latrobe map that I just showed. You can see Jersey Avenue on the left there, and then the row of buildings there, one of which is much wider than the others. This is the other side. You can see on the right is the Longworth building, and on the left is Thomas Law's second house. Now, Law built a whole row of houses here, and he had only the corner one, but you can see it's pretty fancy. It's got a curved point here. Later on, all the buildings were tied together, probably with that porch and a few rooms in the back, and became what was called the Varnum Hotel, or the Varnum House boarding house. But it was, when it was first built, it was broken up into several different boarding houses, and Thomas Law had only the one on the corner. Now, he built this second house across the street from the first one because the first one was in demand to be rented. And as soon as he got this one done, it went in demand, and particularly because on the main floor, which is the one with the porch here, was a ballroom. And that was one of the first ballrooms in Washington. It was an oval room in the curve of the building there. And in particular, Senator Smith of Maryland was a very powerful and wealthy member of Congress, and he wanted this house as his entertainment place. And so Thomas Law moved out and had to move out some tenants to make room for the Smith family. And then Senator Smith's brother got to be Secretary of the Navy, and they all lived there in that corner house. And here you can see it from the map that Latrobe made, and how steep the hill is there through the middle of it. And if you look down in the lower right corner of that triangle, you'll see the indication that there was a curve in the building there that left a point. This is Thomas Law, the guy who built the house, and the other one that I showed you. And this is his wife, Elizabeth Parke Custis Law. But he was 40 and she was 20, and he had investments all over the place, and he would only be in Washington for a month or so at a time, and then he'd go off other places. And Eliza did not like that. She did not like being abandoned. She was a very vivacious woman, and it was not proper for a woman to function individually in society at that point. So she was left while he was gone, and she attracted the attention of other gentlemen in the area, she was unhappy. And so the first divorce recorded in the District of Columbia after it became a government entity was the divorce of Eliza Custis Law from Thomas Law. They very carefully waited until after Martha Washington died, but then they had separated almost immediately. They didn't live together very long, and then their divorce was recorded. But Thomas Law continued to be a dominant figure in Washington and in the Capitol Hill in particular, even though he wasn't really living here all that much, but he still had major investments. Eliza moved to Virginia, and there are several sites in Virginia associated with her.
Steve, one of the questions that our folks had is, they understand that there's some George Washington townhouses on North Capitol. Is there any relationship between those townhouses with Eliza and the Thomas Law activity?
Yes, there are, but that's a long story. And if I get into that, I'm actually going to cover that in another one of these talks.
We'll save it for the next time, one of the other talks. Thank you.
Now, again, we go back to this what became the Varnum Hotel. The picture there is the Secretary of the Navy, Robert Smith. But the drawing that you see here is Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte. Elizabeth Patterson was the niece of the two Mr. Smiths, the senator and the Secretary of the Navy. And the most famous event to take place in that house while the Smiths were living there was a ball given in honor of the marriage of Elizabeth Patterson of Baltimore to Jerome Bonaparte, the brother of Napoleon. And the interesting thing about the drawing is that Elizabeth caused a great deal of gossip and unhappiness amongst the women of Washington by wearing a gown like the one she's got on in the photograph or in the painting, because you did not expose your bosom that way in Washington society. You did in Europe, and that was the way Jerome Bonaparte would want his wife displayed. But it caused great unhappiness and consternation in Washington when she wore a gown like that to that ball. Jerome went back to France, and Napoleon was unhappy because he had wanted to marry Jerome off to someone else. And so Napoleon dissolved the marriage to Elizabeth Patterson, and Jerome married someone else and stayed in Europe. But Elizabeth, using the name Elizabeth Bonaparte, continued to live in Baltimore, she had a child with Jerome, who became prominent in Washington and got to be as far as Secretary of the Navy in later history. But that's the big moment in that house. Now, this is the next block, and this painting on the left was done just before the Civil War in the 1850s. And you can see that not much had been developed there. You can get a sense of the steep hill and how little there was, but you could see the city of Washington had all developed up to the northwest by then. But this gives you an idea of what this neighborhood was like, that it simply had not been developed. The photograph on the right is what that block looks like now. That row of houses there on New Jersey Avenue would have been demolished and other buildings put up. But this is the park that's on top of the House of Representatives parking lot behind the Longworth building. So that's what it looks like today. And of course, you can't see over the edge now, but if there were not buildings in the way, you could see all the way to the Potomac the way you could back at the time of the Civil War. This is the next block down. And this is the one that Thomas Law put a lot of effort into developing. He developed 10 buildings on this and rented them out as boarding houses and businesses and so forth on that next block. That block still exists, but none of this is here because that's where the railroad tunnel is now. that for the railroad line that goes to Union Station from Virginia. But that was a very prominent business block developed right early in our history. So we're continuing to walk down New Jersey Avenue, but now this is the view from that apartment building that we could see in the previous photograph. And I learned this week how to put little arrows on the photographs, and so I've put a little orange arrow there to show you New Jersey Avenue. So what you're seeing here, of course, is the Capitol Dome and the Dome of the Library of Congress, and then the three office buildings. The one to the left is the Longworth Building, and then the Cannon Building, and then the Madison Library that you can see here. But this is what New Jersey Avenue looks like today. It was to be the Grand Avenue, but of course it's not very pretentious today. Now, walking down New Jersey Avenue to the bottom, right just north of, sort of at the bottom of that photograph, we come upon this scene. And at the top left, you can see we're looking off the bridge down into a park. And then below that, you can see you come to a staircase there along New Jersey Avenue. And then the gentleman is going down the staircase in the upper right, and then we go down and take a picture looking back up. This is Garfield Park. This is what the park looks like today. Upper left, you can see some picnic areas and playgrounds and really nice walkways. And then in the lower right, you can see that that is Virginia Avenue as it exists today. It is right next to the railroad tracks. In fact, the railroad originally was just laid right up the middle of Virginia Avenue, and then they had to move the avenue over because the railroad became too important. But you can see they use Virginia Avenue now. It's set up as a paddleball court. They can't do tennis because too many of the balls would go down on the railroad. But paddleball, the balls don't go up over that fence. And so they use Virginia Avenue now as a paddleball court. And there are a couple of courts there. You can see two games going on there. This is also what you see. This is going down South Capitol Street just a little further, and you can see the Southwest Freeway, Southeast Freeway, and the railroad crossing here. But we're getting right to where that square is today. And this is part of it, as is Garfield Park. But this is what exists on that square. This is the Capitol heating plant. It made sense to put it there if there was no square because they were going to be burning coal in here. And they did continue to burn coal in this heating plant right up until Senator Byrd of West Virginia, Senator Cole, died, and then they immediately converted the plant to natural gas and had the coal yards available, and they're now constructing some of those great apartment buildings in the coal yards from the Capitol heating plant. But that is what exists as the public square of Washington. I'm going to show you a few more photographs now of it. This is it from the ground level, and then several different views. You can see the railroad goes right through the site, and there's parking area, and it happens that there are emergency vehicles parked down there. That's where the architect of the Capitol keeps the emergency command posts, and somebody is living down there. They were having a barbecue out there for whatever purpose, and then you've got the satellite dishes that are receiving communications and so forth. But this is what exists in the Capitol Square. What was to be the city square of Washington today is this Capitol power plant.
Hey, Steve,
now we go down to the
Steve, one of the questions is, so the Capitol power plant is the area that was intended for the Grand Square. Was there ever any conversation that sort of said, oh my, isn't that an interesting spot to put the Capitol power plant? Or was it just that plan had been neglected, or what, did they ever discuss that?
That makes a good chance to discuss exactly what happened. and why it did not get built. First of all, and it goes back to the personality of Daniel Carroll. Daniel Carroll was developing this area. It was his land. And then the British came along in 1814 and burned many of his properties and left him in very bad financial shape. He was never in good financial shape. He was very land rich, but cash poor. That was a common problem. George Washington had the same problem. They're very rich because they own all this land, but there was no cash available to develop it. They weren't getting any income from it. And so after the British burned that part of this part of the city, Daniel Carroll stopped investing. He was out of money. And then there was a financial collapse in 1819. The state governments had invested a lot of money in canals. They'd been letting bonds and so forth, and were heavily invested in canals. And they realized what had happened was that the Erie Canal had been built and it was making money hand over fist, but no other canal in America ever made very much money. And most of them lost a lot of money, and somebody finally figured that out and stopped investing in canals. And so all the bonds that the state governments had let to build these canals collapsed. The bonds were worthless, and the economy collapsed. And so there wasn't money to develop the square. There was no one to take up the development ideas that Daniel Carroll had. And nothing happened. So the land was sitting vacant, and they put the railroad through it, and then it was not useful as a public square anymore, and nobody carried on the concept. There really isn't much documentation about it. We just, it's there on the map, and we know what they started to do, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But in summary, the port that they were going to have on the Anacostia River never got developed very much. The canal that they built failed financially. Thomas Law was behind that, and he lost a lot of money on that. The DC government lost money on it, and so there was no economic momentum behind building the square, and so it just never got built. Oh, let's see, I didn't talk about this picture. This is the south end. This is I Street as it crosses South Capitol Street, and these are all brand new buildings. This is a hot real estate market in Washington today, but everything to the left of here was supposed to have been the Capitol Square, and we get to the Capitol. I'm calling it the power plant. It's the Capitol heating plant. It does not develop any power. But a couple of blocks south of there, on M Street, is St. Vincent de Paul Church. And this was designated practically from the beginning as the location of a Catholic church. The churches actually got built in other locations because there weren't many people down here because it hadn't gotten developed. But this was designated, and St. Vincent de Paul Church was built many, many years later. But actually in the location it was intended for a prominent Catholic church. Interestingly enough, the only building that is of national importance that actually sits on that square is the Democratic Party headquarters. You can see it's looking a little dilapidated these days. I assume they're going to repaint one of these days. But this is South Capitol Street, and the one institution of national importance that sits in the area. It's not actually where the square would have been, but it would have overlooked on the square. And just to the right of the photograph here is that Capitol Power Plant. Capitol Heating Plant. Here I have put another little arrow on that original map, and that is the location that we just saw. The square across the canal is the one where the Democratic Party headquarters is. The power plant is on the other side of the canal from the arrow, but that shows you where we are in the process now. But now I want to talk for a minute about that canal. Today, the street that you can see on here that replaced the canal is called Washington Avenue. The state of Washington was unhappy because they were the only state that did not have their own avenue in Washington, D.C. And so they decided, since there was no canal anymore, they decided to name the avenue Washington Avenue. And that runs sort of behind the Rayburn House office building down to South Capitol Street and ends at the Capitol Power Plant. But look, on the other side of the street is the old street designation, the sign that calls it Canal Street. And so that is the last remnant of that canal, is these street signs along the Washington Avenue. This is the path that the canal would have followed. Off to the right, you can see South Capitol Street, and that's where the canal would have been. But the Capitol Skyline Hotel sits where that Capitol Square would have been, across the street from that Capitol Square and overlooking it. This is the location of the attempt to make a commercial area out of it. And it goes back a long ways, much more than most of the other buildings I've talked about, because this area was actually laid out as a city by Daniel Carroll's father long before this area was designated as the national capital. And he was going to build a little town there. He laid it out and called it Carrollsburg. The streets do not track the same. They had to shift the streets from Carrollsburg, and nothing was ever built at Carrollsburg, but there are apartment buildings and so forth now, and a street named Carrollsburg in that area. But this is South Capitol Street again, a couple of blocks south of what I showed you before. The canal would have run right by here. But on the left, you can see this is a flyer about the buildings that they built there. Daniel Carroll wanted to build 20 buildings down there, and he left them as storefronts so that the merchant could live upstairs and sell things off downstairs. And this is what the drawing that they made in order to sell the properties there. They were going to develop these for businesses. And they got them started. They started at least 12 of them. Only 6 of them ever got roofs on them. But when they got the 6 ready to go with roofs, they decided to celebrate all of this with a grand banquet. It was held in the middle of South Capitol Street, there where St. Vincent de Paul Church is now, across the street, in front of these buildings that they've built. This was September the 26th, 1796 on South Capitol Street. Robert Morris was there. He was the man who had financed the American Revolution. He's the richest man in America. And he had bought up thousands of the lots in Washington, but then his finances collapsed and he was never able to develop any of them. But he's there trying to get the process started of developing the city. John Nicholson is there. Nicholson got involved as well. He had connections with Dutch banks, and he bought up thousands of lots, and then he and Morris tried to work together, and they were going to build these buildings on South Capitol, but they couldn't get the cash together. Daniel Carroll was there, and one person who witnessed it made note of the fact that there did not seem to be any animosity between Daniel Carroll and Robert Morris and John Nicholson at the banquet. So she thought they understood the problems that they were having in selling these lots. But they put on this grand banquet. Everybody local is here. They invite all of the artisans that have been working on building the buildings and so forth, and they're going to get launched for the development of this business area, and nothing happened. They had these 6 buildings ready to go, not a single one sold. So they ended up giving the buildings away to the artisans who had constructed them as payment for their labor, because there was no money to even pay for the buildings, for the building of the buildings. And that was pretty much the end of the development of the city square and the downtown area along South Capitol Street. So that's the real answer to the question. The more dramatic one answer is that this banquet was the great moment. So this is where South Capitol Street goes underneath M Street, the underpass there that they're talking about eliminating now. But if you can imagine, if you know that location right there, just north of the stadium on South Capitol Street, and imagine it's an unpaved path there, and they have set up this banquet in the middle of the street because there was no other cleared land in the area. And that is the climactic moment of the development of Washington City Square. These are the guys that were there. John Nicholson on the left, Daniel Carroll of Duddington. We don't have any other drawings or photographs of Daniel Carroll. We just have this one profile to even know what he looked like. And to the right is Robert Morris. Now, I want to talk for a moment about something else in this photograph that I showed you before, and now I'm pointing to this square of houses. And we're going to go down and look at them. They are at the bottom of that staircase that I showed you earlier when I was showing off Garfield Park. And what you see here, the trees right in front of Garfield Park, but this is what is across the street. Here you can see this is an old drawing of the painting of the Capitol Hill. You can see the Capitol at the top of the hill there back before the wings were built. But I point the arrow to point out this particular house. That is the house called Duddington. And that was Daniel Carroll's house. That is the house that had been torn down by L'Enfant in the process of surveying the city because it was under construction. But Daniel Carroll had built it, had not checked with L'Enfant about where it was to be sited, and he was building it 8 or 10 feet out into the right-of-way of New Jersey Avenue. And Daniel Carroll couldn't find, L'Enfant could not find Daniel Carroll to explain to him. And so he simply had his surveying crew tear down the house. Daniel Carroll was not happy about that and went to George Washington, and there was even a lawsuit about it. And eventually they did, in fact, take the same materials and build the house, but back further away where L'Enfant wanted it. And for many, many years, this was the dominant house on Capitol Hill. This is the home of the man, the manor house of the man who owned all of this property and was intended to be right above the square. You can see it's on a very prominent point and the land falls away in front. And that was to be the dominant view from the square. You could see up New Jersey Avenue to the Capitol building, but right in front of you was going to be Daniel Carroll's house. Further up the hill was you would be looking between Thomas Law's 2 houses, and those 3 houses dominated the view of this square. This is a photograph of the house from the other side taken from the Capitol dome. You can see that it's certainly the biggest house around. In front are these white buildings, and those were all military barracks and hospitals that had been built for the Civil War and were used for other things later, and were between the Capitol and Duddington, Daniel Carroll's house. This is a photograph taken of the house with grand gates. Those gates, some of you might recognize, were from the Capitol building, and when they took the gates down around the Capitol, Daniel Carroll ended up with a couple of them, and they became the gates for his mansion. But this was one of the fanciest houses in Washington. This is a land plot of the area. You can see the house was situated by itself, open, had some back buildings and so forth. But he had a whole, what is now 2 city blocks for this mansion. And the mansion was not torn down to the 1880s. It continued to exist. Here you can see it up closer. You can see there was a slope on the land, but the house itself is up on a high point overlooking the Anacostia River and this part of the city, and would have been looking down on the public square. Down at the bottom of this square outside Carroll's property is where that public square was going to be, and that is now Garfield Park that I showed you earlier. Here is the Carroll family gathered right after the Civil War was over on the porch of Duddington, playing their social role as the dominant family, the proprietors and owners of this part of Washington. This is a staircase that was taken out of Duddington when it was torn down and installed in a mansion up around DuPont Circle. They took apart the pieces of the mansion, and various parts of them ended up in other houses in Washington when they tore it down. Here's a drawing that was done just before the building was torn down showing the porch, and this drawing of the mansion itself. There is a pamphlet which is reprinted in our book, Creating Capitol Hill, and these drawings are from that pamphlet. And this gentleman wrote a poem about each aspect of this house that was about to be demolished, that had all this history connected with Washington, D.C. This is why it had to be torn down. This slope is on the Capitol side of Duddington, and it was created by the installation of sewers in Washington. They had to straighten out the streets in the 1870s, and this was done over the protests of the landowners, because you can see that it renders that that high point where the Duddington mansion was useless economically. Nobody would want to build on that property or to have that mansion, because it was so isolated by these steep slopes on three sides. What you're seeing here are the back sides of those utility buildings that were at the back of the property. But the city of Washington ruined the value of Duddington, and the family sued and eventually won a settlement from the city, and then used the money to move away and demolish it. But in its place is a street called Duddington Place. It's only 1 block long. It's the 100 block, and it runs through the center of the area that was the Duddington Mansion. This is what it looks like today. They're tiny houses, but at one point, I believe back in the 70s, a group of people got together and purchased the whole block and redeveloped it so that they're all very fancy, tiny townhouses, and you see lots of children, because young families really like this block. It's a very secluded block. On the next block is an apartment that has a name, Duddington Manor, that has reference to the historic building that used to be there. But this is again taken from the roof of the Agra apartment building. And I want you to notice this building down at the bottom. Very interesting. It has a striking resemblance to Duddington. And in fact, I went down and took pictures. This is right across the street from Garfield Park. It is the Dent School, and the building now serves as the Capitol Hill Day School. It's been restored and in fact made rather luxurious by the day school, which is a venerable institution on Capitol Hill. But even though we went through the records of the DC public schools, we could not find any reference to this building being copied from Duddington. But the building was built only 10 years after Duddington had been torn down. It was built in the 1890s. And we did come upon a complaint that all the DC public schools looked alike, and that they ought to start making the schools reflect their neighborhoods. And so my theory is that in fact that's what they did with Dent School, is that they made it look like Duddington. And here I've got the photograph of Duddington on the left and the Dent School on the right. And would you agree with me that the Dent School was clearly copied from the profile of the Duddington house? Jane, you want to talk about our book?
Absolutely. Steve, you've just done a fabulous job of telling the story. And I've been following the questions, and it's almost like as soon as people think of a question, you answer it. Someone said, what are the cross streets? And the next slide was the map. This is a picture of our book, Creating Capitol Hill, which is available from the Capitol Historical Society. So if you want to know the rest of the story about creating Capitol Hill that Steve has been telling you, it's a well-done book. And we actually are running a special for everybody who signed up for the webinar. You get to have an opportunity to have the book at a discount if you buy it between now and the end of the day tomorrow. But Steve, there was a couple questions that we didn't get to. So while we have a few minutes, I just want to see if you have thoughts about that. Someone said, used to be that Capitol Hill was called Jenkins Hill, but we haven't heard about Mr. Jenkins. Who is Mr. Jenkins?
That is covered in the book. In fact, Mr. Jenkins was a property owner north of here. Daniel Carroll bought him out in the process of the creation of Washington, D.C. The only source of the term Jenkins Hill is the report that L'Enfant wrote after he and Washington came and looked at the hill. He referred to it as Jenkins Hill in that report, and that is the only historic reference to Jenkins Hill at that point, is the point at which they decided to put the Capitol on the hill. The hill was never actually called Jenkins Hill. In fact, it's not a hill, it's only a bluff. And so it didn't have any reason to have a name. And one of the origins of this book is that the Carroll family is very unhappy that people call it Jenkins Hill. It never was Jenkins Hill, and Jenkins never owned it. We don't know why L'Enfant referred to it that way, but it's kind of a historic joke over time that it was just an ordinary hill called Jenkins Hill, when in fact it's not a hill and it was never owned by Jenkins.
Well, there is the answer. And one final question, and we're saving some of these for our ongoing conversation. Next week, we're gonna start a series where we go to an intersection, look at the Capitol from that intersection, and talk about what was there then, what's there now, and have a lot more opportunities for questions, kind of try to do a little informal. But the question that came up is, there have been recent plans for the city to try to create some kind of a grand entrance into Washington along South Capitol. Is there any relationship that you know to the L'Enfant plan of the current plans of the city?
As far as a direct relationship, no. I did actually attend a briefing that Steny Hoyer, the congressman from Maryland who represents that area, did for the U.S. Capitol Historical Society about that plan to create an avenue. And in fact, they are currently rebuilding South Capitol Street Bridge to make a much grander entrance. And my understanding is that the plan is to do away with that underpass I mentioned, which sits where that banquet was held, and make a nice street level avenue up South Capitol Street. So that plan is in the process of being realized.
Isn't that great? Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you so much for your time, your attention, your energy, your knowledge. You have inspired. We're getting a couple people saying, how do we get the book? How do we get the book? You're going to get an email thanking you for participating with information about how to get the book. And so you can go on ahead and do that. And hopefully you'll join us again next week when we go to the intersection and take a look and say, okay, what was the vision here and where are we now? We thank you so much for each of you who joined and who's participating in sharing Capitol history during this challenging time for all of us. Most of all, we hope that you all stay safe, stay healthy, stay well, and we want to try to keep you informed about something you might not know if you didn't participate with the Capitol Historical Society. We invite you all to become members and participate in this and many other programs. Next week, we'll have Steve. We may even be having some additional programs, so we will follow up with you about that. We know that on May 13th, Felicia Bell is coming on, and this is a direct follow-up when Steve's opening conversation was about the Statue of Freedom atop the Capitol, and we talked about the role that Philip Reed played as an enslaved person who got his freedom during the time he was building the Statue of Freedom. And Felicia is going to talk about the role of African Americans in building the Capitol. And so that will be May 13th. It's part of our Scholars series. So we are looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much. See you next week.